Download the slides and go through them along with the video and audio. You still need to make notes and try and express things in your own words. This is important for your own understanding. You still need to go through your manual and do the work points. You still need to explore further through additional reading and online investigation. For example, YouTube has some wonderful resources. While doing online learning, it becomes even more important that you do these things. You'll need to manage your own time and take more responsibility for your own learning. Complex sentences and recursion. By now you've probably got the basics of drawing simple tree structures. In this lecture, I would like us to practice analyzing structurally more complicated sentences, and after that you should be able to explain the following concepts, be able to identify them in sentences, and be able to draw trees for them. For instance, the notion of complex sentences, compound sentences, coordination of sentences, noun phrase, verb phrase, prepositional phrases, etc., and possessive recursion. What do the following three sentences all have in common? He looked at the dog with one eye. Chipiso drank the cocktail on the table. Suzette wants to cook the hamburger today. They all have more than one meaning, which is to say they are structurally ambiguous. But before we talk about structural ambiguity, let's just remind ourselves what we mean by lexical ambiguity. Look at the final sentence. Suzette wants to cook the hamburger today. And I want you to focus on the word hamburger. It has more than one meaning. It could mean that Suzette wants to cook a kind of a sandwich with a beef patty in it. In the United States, the word hamburger could also mean what we in South Africa we would call mince, in which case Suzette would want to cook the mince meat today. There's also the possibility that hamburgers are people from Hamburg, and that Suzette is in a cannibalistic mood and wants to cook some people today. These are all lexically ambiguous because they relate to the multiple meanings of one particular word, in this case hamburger. Structural ambiguity, however, refers to the structure of the sentence being slightly different in each case. He looked at the dog with one eye could mean that the dog has one eye, in which case the prepositional phrase with one eye modifies the noun phrase dog. Or it could mean that he used one of his eyes to look at the dog, in which case the prepositional phrase would probably modify the verb phrase event of looking at the dog. Similarly, Chipiso drank the cocktail on the table could have two meanings. The prepositional phrase on the table could be modifying the cocktail noun phrase, in which case it would mean that the cocktail is on the table and that is what Chipiso drank. The other meaning is that cocktail is modifying the verb phrase, which is the drinking event. The meaning associated with this structure would be that Chipiso is on the table when she drank the cocktail. Suzette wants to cook the hamburger today is also ambiguous, and it relates to the adjunct today. Does it mean that Suzette wants to do the cooking today? Or could it mean something like, today Suzette wants to cook the hamburger tomorrow? All these sentences are structurally ambiguous, which means that they have two syntactic structures or two syntactic trees associated with each of them. Let's try this out for ourselves. So let's look at the sentence, he looked at the dog with one eye. We're going to write that down. We're going to start with some basic analytical exercises by just trying to work out what we see. So for instance, there's exactly one verb here, that's the verb looked, we're going to circle that. And we have a subject pronoun he, so he looked. And we also see that there are two prepositional phrases, at the dog and with one eye. So on our rough work, we're going to start plotting that. We're going to start with a S at the top, and we know that's going to break down to a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The verb phrase breaks into a verb and something else. So let's just put in what we have here. The noun phrase consists of he, and the verb is looked. And now we have two prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrase 1, which is at the dog, and prepositional phrase 2, which is with one eye. So if we think about what this sentence means, there's a verbal looking event, and what is being looked at? Well, it is clearly the dog. So that means that the prepositional phrase is going to link to the verbal phrase. That leaves the other prepositional phrase with one eye unaccounted for. What does it link to? And at this point, we might think about the two meanings that the sentence has. So the one event that we are interested in is that he, the subject, did some looking at the dog and that he only had one eye. In that case, the looking event happened with one eye, and so our prepositional phrase is going to come off the verb phrase at this point. So the meaning that this tree structure portrays is that the dog-looking event happened with one eye. Let us turn our attention now to the second meaning, where it is the dog that has one eye. And in order to capture that meaning, what we will do with this prepositional phrase is we're going to link it to the dog, like that. And now we have a slightly different syntactic structure, which shows that it's the dog that has one eye. Phrase structure rules, recursion. How many phrase structure rules does a grammar require to account for all the phrases and sentences in a language? In the course so far, we've been developing a very simple grammar of English, and we've learned a number of rules, perhaps about 10 to 15. But how many phrase structure rules does a grammar require to account for all the phrases and sentences in a language? Is it the case that we make things up as we go and there are probably an infinite number of rules? Linguistics aims to be a science of language, and science tries to explain how the world works with a limited number of rules. So for language, it would be better if a finite number of rules is responsible for generating all the phrases and sentences in a given language. And during this course, since we've learned a number of these kinds of rules, we realize that we can actually get quite far with a very small number. The rules that we're learning have the following kind of form. S breaks into a noun phrase and a verb phrase breaks into a verb and noun phrase breaks into determiner, noun, etc. You should be thoroughly familiar with these by now. But if you look at these, how can a limited number of rules generate the unlimited creative potential for language? If you look at these rules, you'll see that they have a category on the left-hand side of the arrow and a category on the right. S, for instance, occurs before the arrow, and it also occurs optionally in a number of other rules on the right-hand side of the arrow. This is the core of what makes these rules able to generate an infinite number of sentences. You can take the S rule and plug it in underneath the VP rule or the NP rule. We can also see this with noun phrases. For instance, the noun phrase can break into determiner noun, or it can break into a possessor in a noun, while a possessor breaks into a noun phrase and an apostrophe S. So you could take the noun phrase and plug it into the possessor, which would create another noun phrase, and then you could plug the possessor into that, and then you could take the noun phrase and plug the possessor into that, thus creating an infinite loop of possible sentences. Another way of creating infinity is with the coordination rule. XP breaks into XP and another XP of the same type. In this case, XP is just a placeholder for any phrase. Could be a noun phrase, a verb phrase, a prepositional phrase, or even a sentence. Just so long as whatever you are coordinating, they are of the same type. So noun phrase and noun phrase, verb phrase and verb phrase, but not noun phrase and verb phrase, or verb phrase and prepositional phrase, for instance. Phrase structure rules recursion. What this means is that phrase structure rules are recursive. The same rules apply over and over and can be plugged into each other. That is to say, a phrase of one type can appear inside another phrase. Phrases and sentences can thus be of infinite length. Recursion thus reflects the creativity of human language. Now, recursion comes in two main flavors: coordination and subordination. Coordinators typically include words such as and, or, either or, neither nor, etc. We call sentences with these kinds of words compound sentences. Subordinators include the that complementizer, so, if, then, and infinitival too. Sentences with these words in them we call complex sentences. A coordinate structure is a syntactic unit in which two or more constituents are joined in such a way that each of them has an equal claim to be considered the head of a structure. I've demonstrated a simple tree diagram over here, where an XP is conjoined with another XP. Here are some examples of coordination. Voldet and Impor talked. In this case, what is coordinated are two noun phrases, Voldet and Impor. Voldet talked to the nurse and Impor helped the surgeon. This is an example of two separate sentences which are coordinated. Sentence 1 is Voldet talked to the nurse, and sentence 2 is Impor helped the surgeon. Here is another example of coordination at the sentence level. Either Voldet talked to the nurse, that is sentence 1, or Impor helped the surgeon, that is sentence 2. Here is an example of verb phrase coordination. Voldet talked to the nurse and helped the surgeon. We could ask ourselves, who is it that helped the surgeon? That is to say, what noun phrase does the verb helped assign its agent theta role to? The answer is, it's clearly Voldet who talked to the nurse, and it's also Voldet who helped the surgeon. So in this example, what we have is a coordinated verb phrase. In rugby, you can run with the ball or with the pack. In this instance, the coordinator or coordinates two prepositional phrases, with the ball, with the pack. Let's try it out for ourselves. Voldet and Impor talked. What we have here are two noun phrases with proper nouns coordinated together structure, and the first conjunct will be Voldet, and the second conjunct will be Impor. Together these form a noun phrase subject, and when we plot them, they form part of a much bigger S. We have a verb phrase headed by the verb talked. Voldet and Impor talked. What we have here are two noun phrases with proper nouns coordinated together. So what we're going to draw is draw a noun phrase with the coordination structure, and the first conjunct will be Voldet, and the second conjunct will be Impor. Together these form a noun phrase subject, and when we plot them, they form part of a much bigger S. We have a verb phrase headed by the verb talk. Voldet talked to the nurse and Impor helped the surgeon. If we look at this example, we see that in the first conjunct, Voldet talked to the nurse. That's a whole sentence all by itself. And in the second conjunct, Impor helped the surgeon is also a sentence all by itself. So we can draw the tree a bit like this, with sentence 1 in the first conjunct and sentence 2 in the second conjunct. And then, of course, you could break down each of those sentences in the usual way. S breaks into noun phrase and verb phrase. Voldet's in the first noun phrase. The verb phrase is headed by the verb talked, and is a prepositional phrase attached to talked. Similarly, in the second sentence, Impor is the noun phrase. The verb phrase is headed by the verb helped, and there is a direct object, the surgeon. Let's look at example 4. If we look at the coordinator, the second conjunct on the right-hand side of the coordinator is help the surgeon. There's a verb and a noun phrase. This should give a clue that what we're dealing with here is a verb phrase. So then if we were to draw that out, our coordination would be a verb phrase. The second conjunct would be a verb phrase headed by the verb helped. And the verb helped selects a noun phrase object, the surgeon. The first conjunct also consists of a verb phrase headed by the verb talked, and with a prepositional adjunct to the nurse. Together, these form a compound coordinated verb phrase, which can fit into a larger tree structure as follows, with S breaks into noun phrase consisting of Voldet and our verb phrase. Subordination. A subordinate structure is a syntactic unit in which two or more constituents are joined in such a way that one of them is dependent on or contained inside the other. When we look at this in a tree, it will often seem that one structure is higher up than the other one. There's a small diagram to illustrate this. Here are some examples of subordination. We saw the book on the table near the shelf. In this case, the noun phrase book is modified by on the table, and on the table is modified by near the shelf. And we could extend this. We saw the book on the table near the shelf by the window on the north side of the house. In each of these examples, It is the book that has been modified by a prepositional phrase, and then that prepositional phrase is modified by another prepositional phrase. In this way, you can see some examples of subordination which lead to recursion. Here's another kind of example. In this case, what is being subordinated are whole sentences. The teacher said that the class must leave. You can see that there are two verbs here, say or said, and leave. This means that there are two clauses. The class must leave is a whole clause by itself. There's a subordinator, the word that, and then the main clause is the teacher said. And this can be extended too. The teacher wants the class to leave. This is a very similar sentence, but in this case we have an infinitival clause embedded under a main clause. The main clause is the teacher wants something. The embedded clause is the class to leave. And we can see that leave is an infinitive because it has an infinitival marker, to. We can also extend these sentences with a potentially unlimited number of subordinations. The teacher said that the headmistress knows that the textbook claimed that Africa is a large continent, for example. If we were creative, we could probably come up with a much longer sentence. The main clause is, the teacher said X. Underneath that is embedded, the headmistress knows X. And underneath that is embedded, the textbook claimed X. And beneath that is the clause, Africa is a large continent. In each case, we have a sentence that is embedded under another sentence in a subordinative fashion, and in these examples, the complementizer that, which is colored in green, introduces the subordinate clause. Now look at the sentence, the kitten's paws got dirty. We could probably extend this even further if we were creative enough. For instance, my parents' mother's kitten's paws got dirty. Let's try it out for ourselves. We saw the book on the table near the shelf. Let's analyze the sentence in our rough work first. There's a verb saw, which assigns an agent theta role to pronoun we, and a patient theta role to the book. And there's also a number of prepositional phrases on the table near the shelf, etc. We're going to mark those down in our rough work. To diagram this, we'll start out in the usual way. Sentence breaks into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The verb is headed by the verb saw, and the noun, and it also selects a noun phrase, patient, the book. This leaves a number of prepositional phrases. Prepositional phrase breaks into a preposition, on, and a noun phrase, the table. And we've got to ask ourselves, well, what is on the table telling us about the book? Well, it is modifying the book, the location of the book. It's telling us that the book is on the table, and so we would link those two. What about the next prepositional phrase? Near the shelf, the preposition is near, and the noun phrase breaks into determiner and noun, which is the shelf. And we can ask ourselves, well, what does the shelf tell us about the sentence? Well, it is modifying the table. It's telling us that the table is near the shelf, and so we'd link them like that. This is an example of recursion. The next example is the teacher said that the class must leave. We can see here that there are two verbs that we might be interested in. The first is verb say, and the second verb is leave, supported by a modal must. There are also two clauses. So if there are two verbs, there must be two clauses, because each clause has one verb in it. The main clause is the teacher said, and the embedded clause is that the class must leave. The subordinate or linker is the word that, and that's going to be our complementizer. We can draw a tree of this in the usual way. Noun sentence breaks into a noun phrase, the verb phrase. I've used a triangle for my noun phrase to save a bit of time, but in your tests and exams, please don't do that unless you're explicitly asked to. The verb say assigns an agent theta role to the teacher and selects a sentential complement. We introduce that with the S-bar. S-bar has a complementizer in it, which will eventually be the word that, and the complement selects a sentence. The sentence breaks into a noun phrase and a verb phrase. The noun phrase is going to be the class, and the verb phrase is headed by the verb leave. We mustn't forget to put in our modal, which comes off the S, and the modal bears the tense in the sentence. This will be important for the next example that we're going to be looking at. So the next example is slightly trickier. It is the teacher wants the class to leave. It's similar to the previous one, but different in some unusual ways. So the S breaks into a noun phrase, which is going to be the teacher. Again, I've used a triangle as a way of saving a bit of time, but please don't do this in your tests and exams unless explicitly asked to do so. The matrix verb phrase is headed by the verb want and introduces an embedded clause that we've been writing our comp there, and a sentence structure underneath it. S breaks into noun phrase and a verb phrase. Right. The noun phrase is going to be the class, and our verb phrase is going to be headed by the verb to leave. Now you'll immediately see that the complementizer is supposed to be there isn't anything there, and so we use an empty set thing to show it's there. What about this word to? We could be a bit lazy and say to is just part of leave as a complex verb, but that seems unsatisfying. According to our rules, there is a place between the noun phrase and the verb phrase where we typically put our modal, and we're going to put our to in there. This makes sense in a way because modals bear tense, and to also tells us that the sentence is untensed, so it marks the sentence as non-finite. In summary, syntactic trees are a kind of analysis that helps us visualize the knowledge of language that speakers have. For example, we can use trees to clearly diagram structural ambiguity. Trees also demonstrate that language is recursive. For instance, we can put smaller structures into bigger ones. Recursion leads to subordination and coordination. Sentences that include subordination we would call complex, and sentences that include coordination we would call compound.